So you've seen Dune Part 2, and you might be wondering after the cliffhanger where this story is going in Part 3. Well, I'm going to break it down for you as best I can. Part 3 will presumably be based on the second book in Frank Herbert's saga, Dune Messiah. So I will start by summarizing the events from that book, and then go on to theorize what Denis Villeneuve has in store for us in Part 3. Keep in mind that Part 2 strayed further from the source material, so predicting Part 3 exactly is going to be impossible. Check out my last video to see all the major changes from the book for yourself. However, I should be able to provide some ideas as to where this story could be going. Also, it appears Denis is intending this to be a trilogy, and it should be noted that Paul's story in the books isn't actually complete until Book 3, Children of Dune. This pretty much guarantees that Part 3's ending will be different. Dune Messiah is an odd book, much shorter than Dune and focuses on the fall of Paul Atreides. There's a quote from Frank Herbert when referencing his sequel, Dune Messiah, that says, "The difference between a hero and an anti-hero is where you stop the story." I feel like this quote sums up a core idea of Dune Messiah quite well. I've seen some people defend Denis' source material changes by saying how he is trying to show the audience that Paul is not a hero in order to foreshadow his fall in Part 3. I still am in the camp of not liking pretty much any of the changes, but I do think they are probably correct in assuming this. That being said, I'm not sure it was necessary. Dune Messiah takes place 12 years after the events of Dune. Paul's jihad has swept through the known universe, killing billions. A portion of the populace is actually looking back on Shaddam IV's rule fondly. The only planet spared from Muad'Dib's jihad is that of Caladan, House Atreides' home planet, which is also where Lady Jessica went after the events of Dune. She remains on Caladan throughout all of Dune Messiah and doesn't return to Arrakis until the third book, Children of Dune. She is referenced via letter communications with her daughter Alia, who is now almost 16 years old. Pretty much right away, we are shown a secret meeting on Wallach 9, homeworld of the Bene Gesserit, between the Princess Irulan, Paul's wife but never mate, the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, Edric, a Spacing Guild navigator, and Skytail, a face dancer of the Talaxu. Edric, being one of the fish-like navigators, is imperative for keeping their plot a secret. They can only plot against Paul whilst in Edric's presence, for Paul cannot see other prescient-inflicted people, and Edric literally bathes in the melange which fills the tank that he resides in. This concept of being able to hide from Paul's prescience is actually introduced in the original Dune book when Paul realizes he never saw Count Fenring in any of his prescient visions, despite Count Fenring being in the throne room scene at the end of Dune. Count Fenring is a failed Kwisatz Haderach, and he was cut from Dune Part 2 entirely. His wife, Margot, remains though. Princess Irulan is reluctant to join the plot, but ultimately does because Paul refuses to give her an heir. It is also revealed in the meeting that the princess has been secretly administering a contraceptive to Paul's concubine, Chani, to prevent her from getting pregnant. The Bene Talaxu are a group of genetically altered humans who are highly skilled at genetic engineering. They have a dual purpose in joining the plot to overthrow Muad'Dib. Skytail, being a face dancer of the Talaxu, grants him the ability to take on the appearance of anyone. Skytail reveals to Irulan their plan to give Paul a gula of his late swordmaster, Duncan Idaho. A gula is a clone of swords created from the dead body of the original, in this case, Duncan Idaho. This gula will have the memories of Duncan, but they will need to be awakened. They plan for Hate, the name of this gula, to poison Paul's psyche, for it will be a surprise to Paul, something his prescience won't have shown him. Skytail, whose custom demands his victim be given an escape route, has allowed Hate to be able to tell Paul exactly why he is being given the gula. They also intend for Hate to be a distraction for Alia, who at her ripe age will undoubtedly be sexually interested in Hate. The group also intend to steal a melange maker in order to create their own spice on a different planet. Back in Arrakeen, Chani desperately wants a child with Paul. She also recognizes that Irulan is likely plotting with their enemies and wishes Paul to have a child with Irulan in hopes of ending any plots, on top of providing Paul with an Atreides heir, worried that she cannot give him one. Paul refuses to mate with anyone other than Chani. Paul in his prescience has seen that Chani will die from childbirth and is allowing Irulan to prevent a pregnancy, for he knows it is extending her life. He also sees that death in childbirth is a mercy compared to other future deaths he has seen for her. Paul is desperate to find a way to save Chani from her fate. Hate is gifted to Paul by the Guild. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam is apprehended from the Guild ship by Paul's order. Edric and Skytail are now on Arrakis and interact with Paul. Hate tells Paul that he has been given to him to be his downfall, but Paul, recognizing his old swordmaster in the Gula, allows him to stay, despite Hate telling Paul to send him away. Alia realizes that the Gula is meant as a threat to her as well. Irulan visits the Reverend Mother in her cell. Irulan informs the Reverend Mother that Chani has started a Fremen diet which negates the birth control. Mohiam doesn't want the genetic line ruined by Chani and wishes Irulan to dispatch Chani and to create chance encounters between Paul and Alia for crossbreeding since Irulan has failed her duty. Irulan kind of begins playing both sides of the conspiracy for her own gain, feeding Paul knowledge of the enemy trying to steal a sandworm off planet. Paul sees this as futile. Alia, who has been instructed by Paul to keep a close eye on Duncan, begins falling for him during their investigation on some suspicious murder incidents, courtesy of Skytail. Paul sends for the Reverend Mother and bargains with her to spare Chani's life, in return offering to artificially inseminate Irulan off-planet, not allowing for her child to be legitimized, but securing the genetic line for the Bene Gesserit. Mohiam says she will need to communicate with the Sisterhood on Wallach 9 and decide. Fearful of this bargain, Skytail wishes the Gula to work faster, and so Skytail, in a disguise that Paul can see through, creates a plot involving the rebel Fremen that Paul has to walk into. This plot ends with Paul being given a dwarf encoded with the names of the Fremen traitors. On the way back, Paul, chained by his vision, is forced to allow himself to be blinded during an atomic attack known as a stone burner. Paul physically loses his sight and is only able to see through the prescient vision of the path he is on. Bijaz, the dwarf grown from the same axolotl tanks as the Gula himself, finds an opportunity to compel Hate with the command phrase, "She is gone," that when activated will force him to kill Paul. Chani, now very pregnant, is more confused and frustrated with this newly blinded Paul, who is cryptically following his path. Paul, despite being blind, can see with his inner vision, showing it to the Fremen and exposing the traitors for Alia to take note of. Alia overdoses on spice, attempting to see the vision Paul sees in his blindness. Hate saves her life by getting medical attention and stays with her. She sees that Paul is following a future in which he won't permit himself to be a part of. Paul, completely blind, flies them by Thopter to Sietch Tabor for Chani's birth. Chani is confused by their traveling companions, which consist of basically everyone conspiring against Paul. Chani is led away to give birth and is cynical of Paul's behavior. Paul blindly stares off into the distance, waiting. Hate begins to realize that he has been compelled, remembering that when the phrase "she is gone" is uttered, his memories will awaken. The compulsion will force Hate to offer a bargain to Paul, a Gula of Chani and a planet of refuge in exchange for him renouncing his godhood. When Paul is tempted by this offer, Hate will kill him. Duncan shouldn't find this too difficult with the new knowledge that Paul is a Harkonnen through Lady Jessica's lineage. Hate approaches Paul, confessing his compulsion brings violence. Paul chastises Hate, confident Duncan will not harm him. Paul hears Chani's voice in the distance echoing his name, Usul, and knows she is dead. An aide arrives just after confirming Chani's death. Paul cuts him off though, saying, "She is gone." This command phrase awakens Hate's compulsion. Hate is able to overcome it, fully awakening his memories of Duncan, Idaho. Paul is led to Chani and told she bore twins. The twins are pre-born, similar to Alia having been exposed to high doses of spice from Chani's Fremen diet. He is surprised at this revelation since his vision only revealed to him a girl. Paul wants to be overcome with grief at the loss of his Sihaya, but his vision won't allow it. This new path with two children causes Paul to be blind, unable to use his inner eye to guide him. Hera leads Paul to the twins. Alia arrives guiding the disguised Skytail in order for Paul to hear their bargain. Skytail threatens to kill the babes, offering the same bargain Duncan was supposed to. Paul makes Alia handle the bargaining, buying him time. Paul realizes Hate was given to him in order to prove memory awakening could be achieved in order to add merit to the bargain. Paul is then granted vision through his son's eyes and sees that Skytail's knife is inches from his children. Paul is able to see himself in the third person and notices that no one is paying him any mind, him being a blind man. So judging the distance and angle, Paul throws his hidden blade, taking Skytel through the eye, killing the face dancer. Alia apologizes for being tempted by the bargain. Paul names his son Leto II and his daughter Ganima, meaning spoil of war, the same name Alia used to taunt Hera with when she was a little girl. Paul asks Duncan to lead him to his room and tells Duncan that wasn't part of his vision. Bijaz the dwarf greets them in the room, offering Paul the bargain once again to resurrect his Chani. Paul has Duncan kill the dwarf before he can be tempted. Paul's prescience, fully gone now, allows himself to follow the Fremen tradition of abandoning the blind to the desert for Shai Hulud. Duncan thinks of Paul's last words being, "I am free now." Alia and Stilgar disobey Paul's final orders and execute Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayim and other traitors. Alia, sobbing, calls Paul a fool for not stepping off the path and taking Chani with him. Alia asks for Duncan and through her sobs demands he love her. Duncan confesses that he does, and Alia says, "I know, Duncan, love knows love." Irulan, wailing, claims to have loved Paul and has a desire to raise his children. Alia thinks this might be a last desperate play by the guild, but Irulan seems sincere. This is where Dune Messiah ends. Paul reclaimed his freedom by abandoning his path, the conspirators had failed, and the traitors among them had been exposed for treason. And the Fremen loyalty was secured forever to the Atreides line by Paul adhering to the Fremen custom of sacrificing himself to the desert. But this is not actually the end of the story. All of these characters, including Paul, in the return of Lady Jessica, take place in the actual end of Paul's storyline in Children of Dune. Although it should be noted that the focus of Children of Dune shifts to the twins, Leto and Ganima. Okay, so that is quite a lot of different plot threads weaving all around Paul on an inevitable path toward his downfall. So the question is, how much of that is Denny actually going to give us in Part 3? There are a few major sections I want to touch on and theorize where the plot Denny set up in Part 2 is leading us. These sections will be the time jump, Alia, the ending, and Chani and Irulan. As you may have noticed, the problem with Dune Messiah is that it's pretty much all conspiratorial. The only major action sequences would be the Stoneburner scene resulting in Paul's blindness in the ending. There's also the problem where both of these concepts have already been borrowed by other creators for their own films. Matrix has already done the blind protagonist still able to see, and George Lucas borrowed heavily from Dune Messiah for Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, which I'll get into later. So it seems almost inevitable that Part 3 will have to have a time jump, right? Because the book did. But seeing as there wasn't one in Part 2 where there should have been, I want to explore a few possibilities. First, let's say that Part 3 is going to be fairly faithful to Dune Messiah. This would mean we need a time jump large enough to get Alia to adulthood, because I don't think they're going to want a 15-year-old Alia falling in love with the clone of Jason Momoa in the next film. So we run into some problems. If you do, let's say, a 20-year time jump, you have to age up your actors or explain that the spice has influenced their aging. Now, if they had done that with Shaddam in the last movie, casting him as someone younger, then the spice aging would be foreshadowed for this next movie. They did not, however. Shaddam is very old and looks very old. So another option is to do less of a time jump, say a few years, and you hand wave Alia reaching maturity through some sort of rapid aging from her peculiar birth. This could work, but it would likely feel a bit odd and rushed. What if, though, instead you don't do a time jump? If you notice, the end of this movie did not have a very conclusive ending. Chani storms off on a sandworm, Paul's marriage is not going to be legitimized to Irulan, and Lady Jessica is still pregnant. That's a lot of open threads to just time jump over, which makes me think that if this next movie has a time jump, it will not open with it. Alia is a bit of an anomaly in this next movie because they changed her role in Part 2 so significantly. She is cast as Anya Taylor-Joy, which in my opinion is perfect casting for Alia, especially if they continue making Dune movies past Part 3. Anya playing Alia's possession villain arc in a Children of Dune adaptation would be very compelling. So if we keep it fairly book accurate, in Part 3 Alia's scenes will show her coming into womanhood and falling for the Gula of Duncan, Idaho, as well as overdosing on spice in order to glimpse Paul's vision. We would see her being worshipped as a religious figure in the beginnings of the cult of Alia. There's also the infamous bath scene where Alia, fully nude, begins a training exercise in order to combat her body's desires. Paul, courtesy of Irulan arranging the encounter, as per the Reverend Mother's orders, walks in on his sister combating the training simulation to a dangerous degree. I imagine this scene won't make the cut. The miniseries adapted it but tastefully gave Alia clothing. If I had to make a bet though, I imagine the movie will do something entirely different with Alia. Lady Jessica is still pregnant at the end of Part 2, so it's possible if they forego the time jump altogether that Alia is born at the end of Part 3 instead of the twins. This would mean that Alia would have to be communicating with Paul through some sort of prescient dream sequences like we saw in Part 2. Personally, I really hope this isn't the case. Earlier I mentioned how George Lucas implemented a lot of ideas from Dune Messiah for Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, and trust me, I'm not kidding. Anakin goes to the dark side compelled by a desire to save Padme from a certain death that he has visions of. Paul attempts the exact same thing with Chani, but ultimately realizes he cannot save her. Anakin abandons his path and becomes Darth Vader. Paul abandons his path and walks out into the desert, later returning as the Preacher. Padme dies in childbirth, producing twins, a boy and a girl, Luke and Leia. Chani dies in childbirth, producing twins, also a boy and a girl, Leto and Ganima. The core of Anakin's fall into Darth Vader is undeniably remixed from the end of Dune Messiah. Now, I will likely make a separate video breaking down all the ideas George Lucas borrowed from the Dune saga. But you can see that if Denis follows that ending exactly, people are going to make comparisons to Revenge of the Sith and think Dune is copying Star Wars when really it's the other way around. To be clear, I'm not trying to throw shade at George Lucas or Star Wars by making these likely accurate assumptions. I just needed to point out the similarities so that you might see why the endings are very similar if the next movie stays true to the book. Personally, I think Denis will do something different with the ending anyway, since he is wanting his movies to be viewed as a trilogy. But at the same time, if the studio has intentions to continue the Dune saga for future adaptations, it would make sense to allow the twins to be born. Chani and Irulan are both in very odd places at the start of Part 3. Chani is upset with Paul and riding away on a sandworm, while Irulan is to be Paul's illegitimate bride. This change makes opening the next film with a large time jump seem unlikely. I feel like Part 2 purposely left these cliffhangers to be immediately picked back up in Part 3. It would be very odd to do a large time jump because Paul and Chani are at odds with one another, so that needs to be resolved before a large time jump, or else you just have to make Chani a permanent antagonist to Paul. Because if you open up the next film and say 20 years have gone by and Paul and Chani are still at odds with one another, you've basically killed all believability in their supposed love story. In the book, Chani is very much in love with Paul from the very start, having never left his side. She is his concubine, a mirror of Leto's relationship with Lady Jessica. Chani never stops loving him throughout the book and actually encourages him to produce an heir with Irulan. This is before she finds out Irulan was the cause of her infertility, of course. Throughout the book, Paul's persistence to keep her in the dark on his visions of her death and adhering to the future more than paying attention to the present creates a rift between them. She never stops loving him up until the very end. It's very interesting to point out that Chani is well aware that she is having twins, and there's a moment in the book where Paul refers to the children as singular, and it baffles her. She assumes in his prescience he has to know she is having twins. Paul, being so focused on the future and neglecting to interact with the present and converse with Chani, actually keeps him more in the dark, at least in this instance. Irulan is very much the scorned wife in the book, unable to seduce Paul to her bed or convince him to have an heir with her. This is what drives her to conspire against him. She seems to regret doing so, but her options were limited. It's actually a bit amusing that Chani is the best chance she had at swaying Paul's mind on the matter. Irulan in the movie is a very different character. She is an astute student of the Bene Gesserit and was actually in a position to be influencing her father Shaddam during his rule. In the book, she is a pawn of the Bene Gesserit whose only real value is her ties to her father and then to Paul. Interestingly, in Children of Dune, her sister Wensicia has a fairly prominent role, and Irulan does end up being a guardian of sorts to the twins. Denis showed us in Part 2 that he isn't afraid to deviate from the source material, and I think with Dune Messiah being such a conspiratorial, slower book that he will continue to do so. I believe Denis will keep the core themes of Dune Messiah, which are a conspiracy against Paul, a pregnancy, and the fall of a Messiah. I believe there will be massive changes. I think Paul's conspirators could be swapped into a Bene Gesserit-centric plot, since they have been lurking in the shadows of the past two films. Introducing the Talaxu and using the Spacing Guild navigators, who are practically non-existent in Denis' films, seems like too much, so I believe they are cut. I think if there's a time jump, it will be midway through the film, and I think the child of Feyd-Rautha could actually be used in place of Edric in order to hide the plot from Paul's prescience. This would be a massive alteration, but it would make sense to make the plot thread relevant since it was included in Part 2, especially if Denis truly intends this to be just a trilogy. I think it's highly possible that the Fremen traitor plot thread from the book is instead replaced with the free-thinking Fremen rebelling against Paul, possibly even spearheaded by Chani. I do feel like Chani ultimately will end up back with Paul, since they gave us the line that I will love you until my dying breath. With Chani's absence, I think it's highly possible that Irulan will be much more successful in being close to Paul, subtly manipulating him. I think they will include Paul being blinded for the final portion of the film, because him seeing the path through his inner eye is a cool concept. Honestly, Dune Messiah is a tricky film to adapt, mostly because Part 2 strayed so far from the source material. It makes it difficult for me to predict what could happen, because so many possibilities are still open. I already was thrown for a loop in Part 2 when Lady Jessica remained pregnant the entire movie. Hopefully this video at least helped you understand some of what could happen in Dune Part 3. I think maybe a few years from now, if we get a Part 3 trailer, it will be much easier to see what direction Denis intends to take his finale. If I'm honest, I'm not super optimistic that I will like it very much, but I am very intrigued to see what it turns into. I just hope Alia is in it for more than 15 seconds. In the meantime, consider subscribing to the channel for more Dune and other sci-fi fantasy related content. Until next time.